Exiled at 13, he built a root fortress. Halvor Ingebretson, who had survived 9 Dakota winters and buried a son to the cold, told him plainly, "This is how boys die." He had 11 cents, no family, and needed shelter he could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 minutes. But 5 months earlier, Tobias Erling had never built anything larger than a rabbit snare in his life. In August of 1887, Tobias walked away from the Drummond farm with everything he owned: a canvas knapsack, a hatchet with a cracked handle, 11 cents, and a bruise across his left cheekbone that was still turning yellow. He was 13 years old. He had no family within 1,000 miles, and in Dakota Territory, that meant he had no future anyone could see. The Drummonds had taken him off the orphan train 2 years earlier in Fargo. Silas Drummond had looked him over the way a man looks over a plow horse, checking teeth, squeezing shoulders, asking if he was strong enough to work. Tobias had said yes. He'd said yes to everything that day. The alternative was the industrial school in St. Paul, which the Children's Aid Society agent had described as a place where vagrant boys learned trades. What he hadn't said was that boys went in and often didn't come out until they were old enough to enlist or too broken to matter, so Tobias had worked. 2 years of feeding hogs, mucking stalls, hauling water, splitting kindling. 2 years of sleeping in the lean-to behind the barn because the house had only 2 rooms and the Drummonds needed their privacy. 2 years of meals eaten standing up near the stove because there were only 2 chairs at the table. He'd learned to trap rabbits, to gut fish, to read the sky for weather. What he hadn't learned was how to be wanted. The baby came in July. A boy. Silas Drummond had wanted a son of his own blood, and now he had one. The arithmetic was simple. The Drummonds could feed 3 people through winter. They couldn't feed 4. Tobias wasn't blood. The choice was obvious. Drummond had given him the hatchet as a parting gift, told him there was work in Aberdeen 40 miles east, told him a strong boy could find a place if he wasn't too proud. The bruise came when Tobias asked about the wages Drummond had promised. $2 a month, held in trust until Tobias turned 16. Drummond said there were no wages, said room and board was payment enough, said Tobias should be grateful he wasn't being handed over to the territorial court as a vagrant. That was the law. A child alone with no family and no employment could be consigned to an industrial school by any justice of the peace. The hearings took less than an hour. The confinements lasted years. So Tobias walked east toward Aberdeen, but he didn't make it far. 10 miles from the Drummond farm, he stopped at a creek to fill his canteen and saw something that changed everything. A storm had come through the week before. Lightning, the old-timers said, though no one had seen the strike. What Tobias saw was the result. A bur oak, easily 80 years old, toppled across a shallow ravine. The trunk measured 3 feet across at the base. The crown had crashed into the opposite bank, branches splintered and scattered. But it was the roots that stopped him. The root ball had torn free of the earth in a single violent piece. It stood nearly vertical now, a wall of tangled wood and soil and stone, 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. The mass of it was staggering. Thousands of pounds of interlocked roots, packed with dark earth, tilted against the sky like a frozen wave. And beneath it, where the roots had ripped away, a depression gaped in the hillside, a hollow 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, carved by the tree's own death. Tobias stood there for a long time looking at that hollow. He knew the numbers. Every settler in Dakota knew the numbers. A sod house cost $15 to $30 if you hired help cutting the bricks. A frame house cost $600 or more, plus the lumber had to be freighted from Minnesota. A dugout cost almost nothing, but you needed to find the right hillside, and the roof timbers still required cutting, hauling, and raising. A boy alone couldn't lift a ridgepole. A boy alone couldn't stack 500 sod bricks. A boy alone couldn't do any of the things that survival required. But this was different. The root ball was already standing. The hollow was already dug. The hardest work had been done by lightning and gravity. What remained was filling in the gaps. Tobias didn't go to Aberdeen. He made camp beside the fallen oak and started planning. 3 days later, Halvor Ingebretsen found him there. Ingebretsen was 62 years old and had survived 9 Dakota winters. He'd buried a wife to childbed fever and a son to the cold of 1881. He walked with a permanent forward hunch from decades of fighting wind, and his hands were so calloused the skin looked like bark. He was exactly the kind of man whose judgment carried weight. He looked at Tobias's camp, the canvas tarp stretched between branches, the fire ring, the half-dug expansion of the root hollow, and his face showed nothing. "You the Drummond boy," Ingebretsen said. It wasn't a question. "I was." "Word is you're a vagrant now. Silas told Lindqvist you ran off owing him labor." "Silas is a liar." Ingebretsen's eyes narrowed. "Careful. Silas Drummond has friends in town. He says you're a runaway. The magistrate will believe him. You'll be in St. Paul by harvest." Tobias kept digging. The soil here was good, black loam over clay, easy to work. "I'm not running. I'm staying right here." "Here." Ingebretsen looked at the root ball, the hollow, the scattered branches. "You're going to winter in a gopher hole under a dead tree." "It's not a gopher hole. It's a dugout." "It's a grave." Ingebretsen walked closer, studying the root mass. He rapped his knuckles against the compacted earth between the roots. "A proper dugout needs walls, sod walls 2 feet thick, needs a roof that won't collapse when 3 feet of snow sits on it, needs a door that seals, a stovepipe that draws, and enough firewood to burn for 6 months. What do you have? A hole in the ground and a pile of roots." Tobias pointed at the root ball. "That's my wall. Weighs more than a house. Wind can't move it. Snow can't crush it. I'm building the rest against it." "With what?" "Branches, sod, grass, dirt." Ingebretsen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Boy, I've buried 11 people in this territory. Froze to death, most of them. You know what they all had in common? They thought they knew better than the land. They thought they could improvise. They thought one clever idea would save them from 40 below." Tobias kept digging. His shoulders burned. His palms were blistering. Ingebretsen crouched down to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to tell you what 9 winters taught me. A child alone cannot survive out here. You don't have the strength to cut enough firewood. You don't have the money to buy supplies. You don't have anyone who'll come looking if you don't make it. Go to Aberdeen, find a family that needs a hand. Work through winter under a real roof. This," he gestured at the hollow, "this is how boys die." "I'm not going to an industrial school." "Then find work. Nobody's hiring a boy Silas Drummond calls a runaway." Ingebretsen stood slowly. His knees cracked. "Then you've got until first frost to change your situation. After that, it won't matter what you've built. A boy alone in Dakota winter is a body waiting to be found." He walked away without looking back. Tobias dug until dark. The hollow was 2 feet deeper when he stopped. His hands were bleeding. He had 11 cents, no family, and 12 weeks until the first hard freeze. And Halvor Ingebretsen, who had survived 9 winters and buried 11 bodies, had just told him exactly how he was going to die. The idea came to him that night, staring at the root ball by firelight. He'd been thinking about it wrong. Everyone built shelters from the ground up, dig a foundation, raise walls, set a roof. That was how it was done because that was how it had always been done, but the fallen oak had already done half the work. The root ball wasn't just a wall. It was a windbreak. It was insulation. It was structure. Tobias had watched Drummond build a corn crib the year before. The crib was nothing fancy, posts driven into the ground, horizontal boards nailed between them, a sloped roof to shed rain. The structure worked because the boards overlapped, each one supporting the next. It wasn't strong at any single point, but the whole was stronger than its parts. What if he built the same way against the root ball? The root mass was dense enough to stop wind completely. Nothing was getting through 3 feet of compacted roots and soil. If he leaned branches against it at an angle, longer ones at the bottom, shorter ones at the top, they'd create a sloped surface that would shed snow instead of holding it. Pack grass into the gaps, cover that with dirt. The whole structure would work like a dugout, using the earth itself for insulation, but without needing to lift a single ridgepole. He could build it alone. That was the key. Everything the old-timers said required help, raising walls, setting roof beams, hauling sod. He could do without help because the root ball eliminated the heaviest work. But there was a problem. 2 problems. First, firewood. A proper shelter needed 4 to 6 cords of wood to survive winter. A cord was a stack 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. Cutting a cord by hand, felling, bucking, splitting took a grown man 8 to 15 hours of hard labor. Tobias wasn't a grown man. He could maybe manage half that pace. 6 cords meant 72 to 90 hours of work at best. That was weeks of labor, and he had other things to build. Second, food. He had no money for supplies. He'd need to trap, fish, and forage for everything. That meant time away from construction, time away from cutting wood, time he didn't have. The math kept coming out wrong. There weren't enough hours between now and winter to do everything that survival required. Unless he cheated the math. The dugout families burned less wood than the frame house families. Everyone knew that. Earth held heat the way wood never could. The Soshore family over near Table Rock still lived in their original dugout, and they burned half what their frame house neighbors used. If Tobias built properly, sealed every gap, piled dirt high on the roof, kept the opening small, maybe he could survive on 4 cords instead of 6. 4 cords was still 50 hours of work, but it was possible. Food was harder. But the creek ran year-round, which meant fish. The prairie was thick with rabbits. He knew how to set snares, how to clean a catch, how to smoke meat for keeping. It would be thin living. He'd go hungry more days than not. But it was possible. Possible wasn't certain. Possible wasn't safe. Possible meant gambling everything on an idea that no one had ever tried, that every experienced settler would call foolish, that might fail in 100 ways he couldn't predict. But the alternative was the industrial school. And Tobias had heard enough stories about what happened to boys in industrial schools to know that freezing in a hole he dug himself was the better death. He started building the next morning. The first test came 6 days later, when Gunnar Lindqvist rode up on a gray mare and sat watching for 10 minutes without speaking. Lindqvist farmed 2 miles north. He was Swedish, 40 years old, and cautious in the way of men who had lost crops to locusts and livestock to disease. He believed in doing things properly. He believed in proven methods. He believed, above all, in not taking risks that didn't need taking. Tobias had finished the basic framework by then. Branches ranging from 2 to 6 inches thick leaned against the root ball at a 30-degree angle, their ends braced in a shallow trench he dug at the base. The overlapping pattern left gaps between the branches, but grass packed into those gaps turned them into something close to solid. He was halfway through the grass layer when Lindqvist arrived. Ingebretsen told me about this, Lindqvist said from horseback. I didn't believe him. Tobias kept working. The grass was slough grass, cut from the wetland a quarter mile east and dried for 3 days. It smelled like summer, which seemed impossible given what was coming. He says you mean to winter here, under a tree root. Against it, not under. There's a difference? Under would mean the roots are above me. They're not. They're beside me. They're my wall. Lindqvist dismounted and walked closer. He touched the grass-stuffed framework, pushed against a branch, examined the angle of the lean. This will collapse. First heavy snow. The branches are braced at the bottom and wedged at the top. Snow will slide off, not pile up. The angle is too steep for accumulation. And if the wind gets under it, lifts the whole thing? Tobias pointed to the dirt he'd already begun piling against the base of the framework. 12 inches of soil along the bottom seals it to the ground, more along the sides. The roof layer will be another 6 inches at minimum. Wind can't get under something that's buried. Lindqvist frowned. He walked around the structure, studying it from every angle. What about the entrance? Faces east, away from the northwest wind. I'll build a baffle inside a wall that forces you to turn before you enter the main space. Keeps the cold from blowing straight in. And heat. Small fire pit. Smoke hole in the roof, offset so rain and snow don't fall directly onto the coals. The space is only 6 by 8 feet. Doesn't take much to heat it. Lindqvist stood there for a long moment. Tobias could see him working through the logic, testing it against what he knew of construction and weather and survival. It might work, Lindqvist said finally, for a mild winter. But what about a bad one? 1881, the temperature hit 47 below. 47 below, boy. The spit froze before it hit the ground. Men lost fingers and toes walking from the barn to the house. And that lasted 3 weeks. Not 3 days, 3 weeks. I know. Do you? Because knowing is different from feeling. When it's 40 below and your firewood is running low and the snow is drifted up to your smoke hole, knowing doesn't keep you alive. Planning doesn't keep you alive. Only having done everything right months before, when you had the chance, that's what keeps you alive. Tobias set down the grass bundle. His back was aching. He'd been working since dawn. What would you have me do instead? Go to town, find work, winter with a family, come spring, file a homestead and build proper. I can't file a homestead. I'm 13. Then wait until you can. And in the meantime, where do I live? Who feeds me? Who keeps the magistrate from declaring me a vagrant? Lindqvist had no answer. Tobias could see that. The logic of the frontier didn't make room for boys alone. You belonged to a family, or you belonged to an institution. There was no third option. This is my third option, Tobias said. It might not work, but it's the only one I've got. Lindqvist remounted his mare. I'll say a prayer for you then. I hope your root wall holds. I hope your wood lasts. I hope you're better at survival than you are at taking advice. He rode north without looking back. Tobias worked until dark, then worked by firelight for another hour. The grass layer was finished by midnight. Tomorrow he'd start the dirt. All right, Silas Drummond came on the 3rd of September. Tobias had seen him coming for half a mile, the dust plume rising behind his wagon. He considered running. The creek bottom was thick with brush. He could disappear in minutes, stay hidden until Drummond gave up. But running would prove every accusation true. It would make him a vagrant, in fact, not just in Drummond's lies. So he stayed. He kept working. He was laying the first dirt layer on the roof when the wagon stopped and Drummond climbed down. Drummond was 45 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a temper that showed in the broken blood vessels across his nose. He'd been drinking. Tobias could smell it from 10 feet away. That was bad. Drummond sober was calculating. Drummond drunk was dangerous. Found you, Drummond said. Tobias said nothing. He smoothed dirt across the grass layer, packing it tight. Lindqvist told me where you'd gone. Said you were building some kind of animal burrow out here. Said you meant to live in it like a gopher. Drummond laughed. The whole territory is talking about the Drummond boy who thinks he's too good to work, so he digs a hole like a prairie dog instead. I'm not a Drummond. No, you're not. Drummond stepped closer. His boots crunched on the dried grass. You're a foundling, a throwaway. Your own mother left you on the church steps in New York because you weren't worth keeping. I took you in when nobody else would, fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head. And how do you repay me? You run off. You spread lies about wages I never promised. You make me look like a fool. You turned me out because you had a son. I asked you to find work. You're old enough. You're strong enough. But you'd rather live in the dirt than earn your keep like a Christian. Tobias kept working. The dirt layer was important. It sealed the grass, added insulation, and weighted the structure against wind. Every pound mattered. Drummond grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Tobias looked. He saw the same face he'd seen for 2 years, the small eyes, the red nose, the thin lips always ready to curl into contempt. He felt the same fear he'd always felt. But something was different now. He was standing on ground he'd chosen. He was building something that was his. I'm not going back, Tobias said. Going back? You think I want you back? Drummond laughed again, louder this time. You're damaged goods, boy. No family will touch you now. The whole territory knows you're a runaway and a liar. Your only future is the industrial school in St. Paul, where they break down boys like you and make them useful. Then why are you here? Drummond's face shifted. The mockery faded. Something colder took its place. Because you're my responsibility until I hand you over. A boy I raised, living like an animal, building whatever this is that reflects on me. People talk. People wonder what kind of man lets that happen. What kind of man turns out a boy with 11 cents and a cracked hatchet? Drummond's hand moved fast. The slap caught Tobias across the face, snapping his head sideways. His ear rang, his eyes watered. But he didn't fall. 1 week, Drummond said. I'm giving you 1 week to come to your senses. After that, I'm riding into town and telling the magistrate you're a vagrant. I'm telling him you're living in a hole in the ground because you're touched in the head. And I'm signing whatever papers put you on a train east. You understand me? Tobias tasted blood. His lip was split. 1 week, Drummond said again. Then this game ends. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away. Tobias stood there until the dust settled. Then he picked up his shovel and went back to work. The dirt wasn't going to move itself. He had 7 days. On the 5th day, the widow Magnusson appeared. She was 48 years old, Icelandic, and had lost her husband to a heart seizure the previous spring. She lived alone 3 miles south, running 17 sheep and a small garden. She was known for 2 things, her stubbornness and her silence. She hadn't spoken more than 100 words to anyone since the funeral. She brought a wagon loaded with supplies. Tobias watched her drive up, not understanding. He'd never spoken to her. He'd never even been on her land. There was no reason for her to be here, and less reason for her to bring anything. She stopped the wagon, climbed down, and began unloading without a word. A 50-pound sack of flour, a 10-pound tin of lard, a box of dried apples, a coil of rope, a steel trap, well used but oiled and functional, a wool blanket, patched but thick. Mrs. Magnusson. She held up a hand, silencing him, and continued unloading. A hand saw with a new blade, a clay pot with a lid suitable for cooking over coals, 3 candles, a bag of salt. When the wagon was empty, she finally looked at him. Her eyes were pale blue, nearly colorless, and they examined his shelter the way Ingebretsen and Lindqvist had, carefully missing nothing. "Wool?" she said. "What?" "The roof. You need wool under the sod. Grass packs down, loses air. Wool keeps loft, holds heat." She pointed to the wagon bed. "I brought fleece, raw. You'll need to stuff it between the grass and the dirt." "I can't pay for any of this." "I'm not asking for payment." "Then why?" "Because my husband Rolf would have wanted me to." She turned back to the wagon, pulled out a bundle of raw fleece that must have weighed 20 pounds. He was a foundling, too. Came over on a ship from Iceland when he was 11, alone, no family. The farmers in Minnesota treated him like livestock, said he'd never amount to anything. He spent 2 winters in a sod barn with the horses, eating what the horses wouldn't. She set the fleece on the ground. He built his own first house when he was 16, stone and sod. Everyone said it would fall. It stood for 23 years. We raised 4 children in it. Tobias didn't know what to say. "There's more fleece in the wagon. 3 bundles. It's not charity. It's a trade." "A trade for what?" "When you make it through winter, if you make it through winter, you come help me with the spring shearing. 1 week of work. That's the price." 1 week of work for supplies worth $20 or more. It wasn't a fair trade. She knew it. He knew it. But she wasn't offering charity. She was offering dignity. "Yes, ma'am," Tobias said. She nodded once, climbed back onto her wagon, and drove away without another word. Tobias stood there for a long time, looking at the supplies. Then he looked at his shelter, the root ball wall, the branch framework, the grass layer half covered in dirt. It was crude. It was unconventional. Every old-timer who'd seen it had said it would fail, but Mrs. Magnuson's husband had built something unconventional too, and it had stood for 23 years. Tobias picked up the fleece bundle and went back to work. The shelter was finished on September 28th, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, 5 feet tall at the highest point. The root ball formed the entire west wall, dense and impenetrable. The east wall was stacked sod, 2 feet thick, salvaged from a buffalo wallow half a mile south. The north and south walls were branch framework packed with grass and fleece, then covered in 12 inches of dirt. The roof sloped from the top of the root ball down to the east wall, a continuous layer of branches, grass, fleece, and sod that directed rain and snow away from the entrance. The entrance faced east, into the morning sun, and away from the prevailing northwest wind. Inside, a shoulder-high sod wall forced visitors to turn left before entering the main chamber, the baffle he'd described to Lindqvist, which broke the path of any wind that made it through the door. A fire pit sat in the northwest corner, directly below a smoke hole reinforced with flat stones. The dirt floor was covered with dried grass for insulation and comfort. It wasn't pretty. It looked, as Drummond had said, like something an animal would build. The townspeople who rode by on the main road half a mile north had started calling it the Gopher Hole. Someone had even scratched a crude picture on the signpost at the crossroads, a boy with oversized teeth standing next to a mound of dirt. But it was solid. The root ball couldn't be moved by anything short of lightning. The walls were thick enough to hold heat. The roof shed water and wouldn't accumulate snow. And the earth around it, on 3 sides and below, held steady at 47 degrees regardless of what happened above ground. The firewood was a different story. Tobias had cut 3.5 cords by the end of September. He'd worked from dawn to dusk every day he wasn't building, and the pile behind the shelter proved it. 3.5 cords was more than 160 hours of labor. His hands were permanently blistered. His back ached every morning and didn't stop aching until exhaustion pulled him into sleep. But 3.5 cords wasn't enough. A mild winter needed 4. A bad winter needed 6. He was short, and time was running out. The first frost came on October 3rd. Tobias woke to white crystals on the grass and ice in his water bucket. The shelter's interior temperature was 51 degrees, cool but not cold, exactly what the Earth contact should have produced. He built a small fire anyway, just to see how the space heated. By the time the fire was burning steadily, the interior had climbed to 62 degrees. Comfortable. The smoke rose cleanly through the hole in the roof. The heat stayed inside. It worked. The design actually worked. But the frost meant October, and October meant he had weeks, not months, before the real cold came. He needed more firewood. He needed more food. He needed everything he didn't have. On October 5th, Silas Drummond appeared at the land office in Aberdeen and filed a formal complaint naming Tobias Erling as a vagrant child, unfit for self-governance. The magistrate set a hearing for October 12th. Tobias found out from Lindqvist, who rode down on October 8th to deliver the news. "You have 4 days," Lindqvist said. "After that, they'll come for you. Drummond has 2 witnesses who'll swear you're mentally deficient, says you talk to the tree roots, says you refuse to work, says you're a danger to yourself and possibly others." That's a lie. Doesn't matter. The magistrate owes Drummond money. The hearing's a formality. You lose unless you can prove you're not a vagrant. How do I prove that? Lindqvist was quiet for a moment. Then, employment. If you have steady work, you're not a vagrant. If someone respectable vouches for you, the court has to listen. No one's going to hire me. No, Lindqvist agreed. Probably not. He left without offering more. Tobias sat outside his shelter as the sun went down. The temperature dropped into the 30s. He could feel winter coming, taste it in the air. That metallic sharpness that meant cold was building somewhere north, cold that would sweep down across the prairie like a wave. He'd built his shelter. He'd cut his firewood. He'd done everything he could to prepare for the season that killed the unprepared. And none of it mattered if Drummond dragged him to St. Paul before the first snow fell. 4 days until the hearing. The earth beneath him held steady at 47 degrees. The root balls stood solid against the darkening sky. The prairie stretched out in every direction, endless and indifferent. And somewhere in Canada, something was gathering. A wall of Arctic air, colder than anything the frontier had seen in years, was beginning to move. The real test was still coming. The hearing never happened. On the morning of October 12th, Mrs. Magnuson walked into the Aberdeen land office with a document she'd written herself. It was a contract of employment dated September 20th, stating that Tobias Erling was engaged as a seasonal laborer for the Magnuson farm, with compensation in the form of room, board, and supplies. The contract specified spring shearing, fall harvest assistance, and winter maintenance as needed. It bore her signature and Tobias's mark. The magistrate read it twice. He looked at Mrs. Magnuson, a property owner, a widow of good standing, a woman no one had ever accused of dishonesty. He looked at Silas Drummond, whose face had gone the color of old brick. "This appears to be in order," the magistrate said. "It's a forgery," Drummond said. "She's lying to protect him." Mrs. Magnuson didn't raise her voice. "I'm a member of the Lutheran congregation in Aberdeen. I've paid taxes on my land for 11 years. I've never been accused of bearing false witness. Mr. Drummond turned this boy out with nothing and now wants to profit from his confinement. I'm offering him honest work. The court can decide which of us is lying." The magistrate decided. The complaint was dismissed. Drummond stormed out without speaking. Tobias didn't see him again until spring. But Mrs. Magnuson's contract meant real obligations. Twice in October, Tobias walked the 3 miles to her farm and spent the day mending fences, splitting her firewood and helping move the sheep to their winter shelter. The work was fair payment for what she'd given him, more than fair, and it gave him something he hadn't expected, someone who checked on him. She came by the root shelter once a week through November, never stayed long, never said much, but she looked at his firewood pile, asked about his food stores, examined the shelter's seams for gaps. She brought small things, a jar of pickled beets, a pair of wool socks her husband had never worn, a steel needle and thread for mending. She never called it charity. She never called it anything. She just appeared, looked, left. The shelter held. November brought the first real cold, temperatures dropping to 15 degrees, then 10, then 5 below. Tobias banked his fire at night and woke to interior temperatures of 42 degrees, cold enough to see his breath, warm enough to survive. He burned a quarter cord that month, less than he'd feared. The earth walls held their heat like stone. The root ball blocked wind so completely that on the calmest days, he could hear individual snowflakes landing on the sod roof above him. December was harder. The temperature hit 20 below on Christmas Day. Tobias stayed inside for 3 days straight, feeding the fire every 2 hours, melting snow for water, eating dried rabbit and the last of Mrs. Magnuson's apples. His firewood pile shrank. By New Year's Day, he had 2.5 cords left. Enough for a normal January and February. Not enough for anything worse. Halvor Ingebretsen stopped by on January 3rd. He stood outside the shelter's entrance and looked at the structure the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe. "You're alive," he said. "I am." The Hendrickson boy froze in his family's barn last week. He was 17, had a proper roof over his head. You're living in a dirt pile, and you're alive. The dirt pile stays warm. Ingebretsen shook his head slowly. "I've lived here 31 years. I've never seen anything like this winter. 3 weeks below zero in December. The old-timers are saying it's not done. They're saying January will be worse." He looked at Tobias's firewood pile, counted the rows, did the math. "You're short." "I know. If it stays this cold, you'll run out by mid-February." "I know. What are you going to do?" Tobias didn't have an answer. He'd done everything he could. He'd built a shelter that worked. He'd cut more wood than anyone thought a boy could cut. He'd trapped and fished and foraged until his snares knew his hands by touch, and it still wasn't enough. "I'll figure something out," he said. Ingebretsen looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Dried venison, about 4 pounds. My wife says you're too thin." Tobias took the bundle. His throat felt tight. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Survive. That's the only thanks that matters." Ingebretsen walked away into the gray January afternoon. The sky to the northwest was the color of lead. The air smelled like metal. 9 days later, the world ended. The morning of January 12th was warm. Tobias woke to interior temperatures of 54 degrees, warmer than any morning since November. He crawled outside and found the air soft, almost balmy. The thermometer Mrs. Magnuson had given him read 38 degrees. In January. In Dakota. He knew it was wrong. Warm days in deep winter meant something was building. Something was gathering. Something was about to break. The old-timers called it weather-making, the prairie drawing breath before it screamed. But the sun was shining. The snow was melting. And he needed more firewood. He took his hatchet and walked north toward the creek bottom, where dead elm branches hung low enough to reach. The work was slow. His arms had lost strength over the winter, and every swing of the hatchet sent aches through his shoulders. But by noon, he had a bundle of branches worth maybe 1/8 of a cord, Not much. Something. He stopped to rest on a fallen log and ate a strip of dried venison. The sky was still clear. The temperature was still climbing. Sweat ran down his back under his coat, a sensation so foreign after months of cold that he almost laughed. That's when he saw the girl. She was walking across the open prairie a quarter-mile east, following the path that led from the Lindqvist farm toward town. She was small, 8 or 9 years old, and she was alone. Her coat was open. She wasn't wearing a hat. Tobias recognized her. Ingrid Lindqvist, Gunnar's youngest daughter. She'd been at the Aberdeen school that morning, he guessed. Walking home now, because the weather was fine. Because everyone knew you didn't need a coat when it was 38 degrees. Because January never stayed warm for long, so you took what you could get. He watched her walk. She was singing something, her voice too faint to hear. The sun was behind her, making her shadow stretch long across the melting snow. Then he looked northwest. The horizon had changed. Where there had been clear sky an hour ago, there was now a wall. It rose from the earth like a living thing, black at the base and gray above, rolling toward them faster than any storm he'd ever seen. The top of the wall seemed to boil, clouds tumbling over themselves, and beneath the clouds was something darker, a churning mass of snow and ice and wind that ate the landscape as it came. Tobias had never seen anything move that fast. It was covering ground faster than a horse could gallop, faster than a train. The leading edge was maybe 3 miles away, and he could already hear it. A sound like thunder that didn't stop, a continuous roar that made the air shake. He ran. The bundle of branches fell forgotten behind him. His boots slipped on the melting snow. He screamed Ingrid's name, but his voice was lost in the growing roar. She didn't turn. She kept walking, singing her song, watching her shadow on the snow. He was 200 yards away when the storm hit her. It hit him 3 seconds later. The world vanished. The cold came first, a slap of air so brutal that his lungs seized and his eyes streamed tears that froze on his cheeks before they could fall. Then the wind, 60 miles an hour of raw force that knocked him off his feet and sent him tumbling across the snow. Then the snow itself, but it wasn't snow, it was ice. Hard, crystalline particles that stung like needles, that found every gap in his clothing, that filled his nose and mouth and made breathing impossible. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear anything except the roar. He couldn't tell which direction he was facing. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in less than a minute, and it was still falling. Ingrid. The girl was out here somewhere. She was 8 years old and wearing no hat. Tobias got his hands under himself and pushed it up to his knees. The wind knocked him down again. He tried to crawl, but he didn't know which way to go. Every direction looked the same, white and gray and howling darkness. He had to get to shelter, his shelter. The root ball was maybe a quarter-mile south. He could make it. He knew the land, knew the shapes of the trees and the dips in the terrain. Even blind, he could find his way. But the girl, he crawled northeast toward where she'd been standing when the storm hit. The snow drove into his face like gravel. His coat was already frozen stiff. His fingers were going numb, 20 feet, 30. He called her name, but the wind ripped the words away. 40 feet. His hand touched something soft, fabric, a coat sleeve. He grabbed it and pulled. Ingrid came out of a snowdrift like a ghost, white with ice, her eyes squeezed shut, her small body shaking so hard he could feel it through his frozen gloves. She was alive. She was conscious. She couldn't walk. Tobias pulled her against his chest and started crawling south. He navigated by memory and by the wind. The wind came from the northwest. Everyone knew that. Every Dakota child learned it before they learned to read. If he kept the wind on his right cheek, he was going south. South was the root ball. South was survival. The crawl was endless. His knees tore through snow and found frozen earth beneath. His arms burned from dragging Ingrid's weight. The cold ate into him from every direction, stealing heat faster than his body could make it. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. He couldn't feel his hands, but he could feel the girl shivering against him. As long as she was shivering, she was alive. When the shivering stopped, she would be dying. 50 yards, 100. He lost count. The roar filled everything, made thinking impossible, made planning impossible. There was only the next movement, the next inch. His hand hit something solid. Wood. Roots. The root ball. He pulled himself along the base of the root mass, searching for the entrance. East side. The entrance faced east. He dragged Ingrid around the curve of the frozen roots, and suddenly the wind dropped. The root ball blocked it. The shelter's entrance gaped in front of him, a black hole in the white chaos. He pulled Ingrid inside and collapsed. The shelter's interior was 44 degrees. Tobias lay on the dirt floor gasping, his lungs burning from the cold air he'd swallowed. Ingrid was curled beside him, still shaking, her lips blue and her skin the color of candle wax. They were both covered in ice, their clothes frozen into stiff shells, their hair matted with crystals. He had to move. He had to make fire. If they stayed wet and still, they would die. The firewood was stacked against the north wall. His fingers wouldn't work. The joints felt like they were filled with broken glass, but he forced them to pick up kindling, forced them to strike his flint against steel, forced them again and again until a spark caught and a flame began to grow. The fire built slowly, too slowly. Ingrid, shivering, was growing weaker. Tobias stripped off his frozen coat and wrapped it around her on top of her own. The wool was ice-crusted, but would warm as the fire grew. He found the blanket Mrs. Magnuson had given him and wrapped that around her, too. Then he fed the fire until it roared, burning wood faster than he should, pouring heat into the small space. 20 minutes later, the interior temperature hit 58 degrees. An hour after that, 64. The shelter was working. The earth walls held heat. The root ball blocked the wind that was screaming outside at 60 miles an hour. The roof, buried under what must have been 2 feet of snow already, didn't move. Ingrid's shivering strengthened. Color crept back into her cheeks. Her eyes opened. Where am I? Safe. The storm. We're inside. It can't reach us here. She looked around at the dirt walls, the root-tangled ceiling, the fire crackling in its stone-ringed pit. Her eyes were wide, confused. This is the gopher hole. Papa said you lived in a gopher hole. Your papa was right. It's warm. Yes. It's warm, and the storm is outside. She said it like she was solving a puzzle, like the pieces didn't quite fit. Why is it warm? Tobias looked at the walls he'd built, the roof he'd sealed, the root ball that anchored everything. Because the earth doesn't get cold, not down deep. The storm is up there, trying to freeze everything, but down here the earth just keeps being the earth. Ingrid pulled the blanket tighter. Papa said you'd die here. Your papa was wrong. The storm raged for 18 hours. Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30, then 40. The wind never weakened. The snow never stopped. Through the smoke hole in the roof, which Tobias had to clear twice, digging through accumulating snow with a stick, he could see nothing but white chaos. They burned almost half a cord of firewood that night. It was too much. It would leave him dangerously short if February brought another cold snap, but he couldn't let the temperature drop. not with a child in his care, not with frostbite already blackening two of Ingrid's toes. He made soup from dried venison and melted snow. He told her stories about the orphan train, about the boys he'd known in the children's home in New York, about the ship his mother might have arrived on if she'd been an immigrant instead of whoever she'd been. He didn't know if the stories were true. He didn't know anything about his mother except that she'd left him on a church doorstep, but Ingrid was 8 years old and terrified, and stories were better than silence. The fire painted shadows on the root-tangled walls. The wind howled above them like something hungry, and the shelter held. At dawn on January 13th, the storm stopped. Tobias dug out through the entrance, which was buried under 4 feet of drift. The world outside was unrecognizable, a landscape of pure white, dunes and valleys of snow where flat prairie had been, the sky scrubbed blue and empty. The temperature was 37 below zero. His breath crystallized before it left his mouth. The root ball rose out of the snow like a monument, unchanged, unmoved, exactly where it had stood since the lightning strike of 1887. The shelter beneath it had collected barely any snow on its roof. The steep angle had shed the accumulation downwind, just as Tobias had designed. He looked north, toward the Lindqvist farm. The buildings were invisible behind the drifts. He looked east, toward town. A smudge of smoke rose from somewhere near the crossroads. Then another, then 3 more. The survivors were already burning their dead. Ingrid couldn't walk. Her frostbitten feet had swelled to twice their normal size overnight. Tobias wrapped her in every piece of fabric he had, carried her out through the drift, and began the journey north. The Lindqvist farmhouse was still standing, but the roof of the barn had collapsed. Tobias found Gunnar Lindqvist sitting in the snow beside the wreckage, staring at nothing. His wife, Margaret, stood in the doorway of the house, clutching their infant son, her face a mask of grief so complete it had stopped looking like emotion at all. They'd been searching for Ingrid since the storm stopped. They'd assumed she was dead. All night they'd lain awake listening to the wind and knowing their daughter was somewhere in it, freezing, dying, dead. When Tobias walked out of the snow carrying the girl they had already mourned, Gunnar Lindqvist didn't speak. He took his daughter from Tobias's arms, pressed her against his chest, and wept. Margareta ran to them. She touched Ingrid's face, her hair, her hands. She looked at Tobias with eyes that held something he'd never seen directed at him before. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. He was real to her now. He was a person who had done a thing that mattered. How? Gunnar finally managed. The storm. Nothing could survive. She was in my shelter, Tobias said. The root ball shelter. I found her on the prairie and brought her inside. The shelter stayed warm all night. Gunnar looked at him. The same Gunnar Lindqvist who had examined the shelter in September and said it would collapse. The same man who had warned about 47 below and asked what Tobias would do when the real cold came. You saved my daughter. The shelter saved her. I just built it. Gunnar's jaw worked. He was a proud man, a man who believed in doing things properly, and Tobias could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the admission that he'd been wrong against a lifetime of believing he knew best. I told you it wouldn't work, Gunnar said. You did. I told you boys die in winters like this. You did. Gunnar looked at his daughter still breathing, still alive because of a hole in the ground and a wall of roots. I was wrong. 3 words. They cost him something to say. Tobias could see that too. A lot of people were wrong, Tobias said. It doesn't matter now. The death count came in slowly. 17 people had frozen in the area around Aberdeen in 18 hours. 3 children walking home from school had been found within a quarter mile of their own farms, dead in the snow, unable to find shelter they could almost reach. A young teacher named Louisa Paulson had kept her students at the schoolhouse all night, burning every piece of furniture to stay warm, and had survived. But one of her students, a 6-year-old girl named Hattie Rosberg, had died in her arms at dawn. The postmaster's wife had frozen solid between the general store and the post office, 60 feet apart, and the Hendrickson family, the same family whose son had frozen in December, had lost their remaining 3 children when their sod house roof collapsed under the snow weight. All 3 were found in their beds, buried under sod and ice. Halvor Ingebretsen came to the root shelter 3 days after the storm. He walked around the structure slowly, examining everything: the root ball, the walls, the roof that hadn't collapsed, the entrance that had stayed clear enough to dig out. His face showed nothing. His eyes showed everything. 62 degrees, Tobias said. That's what the shelter held through the worst of it. Outside it was 40 below. Inside it was 62. The Hendrickson place was built proper, Ingebretsen said. 2-foot sod walls, good roof timbers, everything the way it should be. The roof was flat. Snow accumulated. The timbers couldn't hold it. Your roof didn't accumulate. The angle and the root ball blocks the wind, so the snow blows over instead of piling up. Ingebretsen stood there in the cold January sun, looking at the structure that every old-timer in the territory had said would fail. I told you this was how boys die. I said a child alone couldn't survive. I remember. I've been on this prairie for 31 years. I've seen winters that killed whole families. I thought I knew what worked and what didn't. He turned to face Tobias. I was wrong. Your root wall held when proper sod roofs collapsed. Your design worked when conventional methods failed. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I owe you the admission that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. That's the hardest kind of debt. Ingebretsen reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The county is recording deaths and damages. They're also recording what worked. I wrote down what you built here, the dimensions, the materials, the angles. I want to file it as a matter of public record, so the next family that needs a quick shelter in a hurry knows there's another way. Tobias took the paper. It was covered in careful handwriting, measurements and notes, and a crude diagram of the root ball structure. At the bottom, Ingebretsen had written, Tobias Erling Shelter, Creek Bottom 4 miles south of Aberdeen. Maintained 62 degrees interior during the blizzard of January 12th to 13th, 1888, when exterior temperatures reached 40 below. Structure intact. Occupants survived. You're making me a record, Tobias said. I'm making the truth a record. What you did here deserves to be remembered. The conversions came quickly after that. Gunnar Lindqvist brought his brother to see the shelter in late January. The brother was building a new homestead claim in the spring and wanted to know if the root ball method would work while he saved money for a proper sod house. Tobias showed him everything: the angles, the fleece insulation, the baffle at the entrance, the way earth contact kept the interior warm with minimal fire. Mrs. Magnuson sent word that 3 Norwegian families near her farm wanted to know more about the design. Tobias walked 3 miles in February, cold, to explain it to them. They listened without interruption, asked careful questions, and began scouting their own land for fallen trees with intact root balls. By March, 4 new shelters were under construction across the county. None were exactly like Tobias's. Each builder adapted the design to their own materials and terrain, but all used the same principle: an existing natural structure as the primary wall, earth contact for insulation, a steep roof angle to shed snow. The design spread because Tobias never asked for payment. He never claimed ownership. When people asked how he'd thought of it, He told them about the fallen oak, about the lightning strike, about looking at the root ball and seeing a wall instead of wreckage. He told them that desperation was the best teacher and that sometimes the obvious solutions were wrong because no one had needed them before. Silas Drummond heard about the shelter's success. He heard about the Lindqvist girl, about Ingebretsen's public record, about the county noting Tobias's design as a survival resource. He heard all of it, and he never came to see for himself. He never apologized. He never acknowledged that the boy he'd turned out with nothing had built something that worked when Drummond's own farm buildings had lost half their shingles to the wind. Some men couldn't admit they were wrong. Tobias had learned that early. He didn't waste time hoping Drummond would change. Spring came late that year. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, and the creek ran high with meltwater well into May. Tobias worked Mrs. Magnuson's spring shearing as promised, a full week of wrestling sheep and bagging wool, exhausting work that left him aching but satisfied. She paid him in supplies again: flour, salt, dried beans, and a new hatchet with a solid handle. He filed his own homestead claim on his 21st birthday in 1895. 160 acres 2 miles from the root ball shelter, where he'd survived the worst blizzard in frontier history. He built a proper sod house that year, but he kept the root shelter standing. It became a landmark, a place people pointed to when they told the story of the 13-year-old orphan who'd lived through January 12th. Ingrid Lindqvist walked again by summer, though she lost 2 toes to the frostbite. She visited Tobias at the root shelter twice a year for the rest of his life, once in January on the anniversary, and once in September on the day he'd finished building it. She never forgot that she'd woken up warm when she should have woken up dead. Tobias married in 1902, a Swedish immigrant's daughter named Astrid, who thought dirt walls were practical and root balls were interesting. They raised 3 children in the sod house, then a frame house when lumber prices dropped, then a brick house when the county seat moved closer and property values rose. Tobias never got rich, but he never went hungry either. He died in 1941 at the age of 67, with his wife beside him and his children in the next room. The blizzard of January 12, 1888, killed 235 people across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and the surrounding states. Most of the dead were children, caught between school and home when the storm arrived with no warning and no mercy. The temperature that morning had been 38 degrees. By midnight, it was 40 below. The drop happened so fast that people froze within sight of their own doors. Halvor Ingebretsen, who had survived 9 Dakota winters before that day and would survive 12 more after, had looked at a boy's improvised shelter and said, "This is how boys die." He was right about boys. He was wrong about this one. The root ball still stands in the creek bottom 4 miles south of Aberdeen. The tree it belonged to rotted away decades ago, but the root mass, that dense tangle of wood and stone and compacted earth, remains. The hollow beneath it filled in long ago. The walls Tobias built collapsed back into the prairie, but the root ball itself, the structure that blocked 60-mile-an-hour winds and held a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old girl alive through the worst night in frontier history, that wall of tangled roots still rises against the sky exactly where lightning put it. On January 12th, when the temperature drops and the wind comes screaming out of the northwest, the root ball casts the same shadow it cast in 1888. The same shape, the same angle, the same darkness against the snow. Tobias Erling had never built anything larger than a rabbit snare in his life. Then he built a fortress from wreckage, and when the blizzard came to bury everything the settlers had made, the fortress held. The earth doesn't get cold, not down deep. That's what he told the girl when she asked why the gopher hole was warm. The earth just keeps being the earth.